Egypt remembers Pepi II Neferkare as the boy who became pharaoh at just 6 years old, and who may have ruled for over 90 years, the longest reign recorded in all of antiquity. Yet by the end of his lifetime, the Old Kingdom, the very system that had built the pyramids, collapsed into famine, fragmentation, and despair. How can the same monarch embody both the height of Egypt's divine kingship and the ruin of its most glorious age? For us today, it raises a universal question: what happens when political power lasts too long, outliving the very institutions meant to sustain it? Pepi's reign is surrounded by extraordinary claims. Some sources describe a civilization hollowed out by neglect, while later traditions add lurid tales of cruelty and corruption. But separating evidence from legend is the historian's task. Stay with me. By the end of this investigation, you'll know which stories are supported by archaeology, which are exaggerations or myths, and why Egypt's Old Kingdom, after centuries of stability, fell apart during history's longest ruling king. If you want source-backed history told like a thriller, subscribe now to Tale of History. One tomb inscription praises Pepi's officials for keeping order, yet another papyrus laments hunger and chaos. Which tells the truth? When Pepi II, also known as Neferkare, came to the throne of Egypt around 2278 BCE, the country was at its political and cultural height. The Great Pyramids of Giza had already stood for nearly 3 centuries, colossal monuments that testified to an extraordinary system of organization, resources, and belief. Egypt's Old Kingdom, often called the Age of the Pyramids, was defined by centralized rule, a reliable Nile economy, and the ideology of divine kingship. Pepi's accession, at an age when most children were still learning to read hieroglyphs, placed him at the center of a system both powerful and fragile. The Abydos king list, created centuries later in the reign of Seti I, and the Turin royal canon, a Ramesside papyrus, both recorded astonishingly long reigns for Pepi. The Turin canon preserves a figure of over 90 years. It would make Pepi not just the longest reigning monarch of Egypt, but of world history. Even modern demographers, cautious about exaggerations, generally accept that his rule lasted at least 6 decades, with many scholars leaning toward the full 90-year span. Such longevity meant that Pepi's reign stretched across 3 generations of subjects. Whole cohorts of Egyptians were born, lived, and died under a single king. The psychological and political consequences of this extraordinary duration would prove decisive for the Old Kingdom's fate. Like his predecessors of the 6th dynasty, Pepi II commissioned a pyramid complex at South Saqqara. Though smaller than the colossal structures of the 4th dynasty, his pyramid was accompanied by pyramid texts, inscriptions designed to guide the king into the afterlife. These texts, carved into the walls of the burial chambers, are among our most important sources for Old Kingdom religious belief. They speak of the king ascending to the heavens, joining the sun god Ra, and ruling eternally among the stars. But the scale of Pepi's pyramid reflects a turning point. Resources once lavished on enormous pyramids were increasingly stretched thin. Later Old Kingdom pyramids are smaller, more poorly constructed, and often hastily finished. Pepi's own monument, though still a massive undertaking, reveals a decline in craftsmanship compared with earlier generations. Archaeologists note reused blocks and less careful masonry, suggesting both resource constraints and administrative fatigue. The Old Kingdom functioned through a centralized bureaucracy headquartered at Memphis. This system depended on scribes, officials, and provincial governors to record harvests, collect taxes, and mobilize labor. Tomb inscriptions of high-ranking administrators under Pepi II give us glimpses into this machinery. Officials such as Wayne the Elder, who served earlier 6th dynasty pharaohs, left autobiographical inscriptions describing military campaigns, judicial authority, and building projects. Under Pepi II, however, the prominence of local officials grew, especially provincial governors, nomarchs, whose decorated tombs outside Memphis reveal both wealth and independence. This shift marks a subtle but critical development. While earlier pharaohs concentrated power tightly at the center, Pepi's lengthy reign allowed provincial families to entrench themselves. Over time, the balance tilted away from royal authority toward local autonomy, a dynamic that would later contribute to fragmentation. Egypt's entire prosperity rested on the Nile. Predictable inundations deposited fertile silt, enabling surplus grain harvests that funded everything from pyramid construction to international trade. During the early Old Kingdom, these floods were relatively stable, supporting Egypt's spectacular growth. But toward the late 6th dynasty, evidence from geological cores and Nilometer inscriptions suggests irregular flood levels. Too little water meant famine, too much destroyed fields and villages. Even modest irregularities strained the carefully calibrated tax and storage systems. By Pepi II's time, signs of stress begin appearing in both archaeological layers and inscriptions, settlements abandoned, granaries showing signs of depletion, and skeletal evidence of malnutrition among commoners. These shifts did not immediately topple the system, but they eroded the foundations of prosperity that had once seemed eternal. The Old Kingdom was not isolated. Trade routes linked Egypt to Nubia for gold and exotic goods, to the Levant for cedar wood and luxury items, and across the Red Sea for incense. Expeditions recorded in inscriptions from Pepi's reign demonstrate ongoing contact. Yet maintaining these networks required military oversight and economic stability. As central authority weakened in Pepi's later years, these links became increasingly vulnerable. Archaeological finds in Nubia suggest that Egyptian influence receded, while Levantine city-states consolidated their own independence. The erosion of foreign trade not only reduced luxury imports but also undermined the ideological image of the pharaoh as controller of all lands. What we know of Pepi II comes largely from king lists, pyramid texts, scattered inscriptions, and archaeological evidence. But the record is strikingly silent in key areas. Unlike earlier dynasties, we lack monumental triumph inscriptions boasting of military victories or vast building projects. This silence has invited both speculation and exaggeration. Later stories, written centuries after Pepi's death, describe corruption, cruelty, and depravity. They reflect genuine memories of crisis crafted by later scribes to explain Egypt's collapse. Skeletal studies from cemeteries dated to Pepi II's time reveal that average adult stature declined compared to earlier Old Kingdom periods. This suggests nutritional stress across the population, a scientific clue that life for ordinary Egyptians was deteriorating even as the king's reign continued. Such a biological marker of social decline is a stark reminder that behind the inscriptions and pyramids were real human bodies, bearing the costs of systemic weakness. Pepi II's extraordinary longevity became a double-edged sword. In theory, it offered stability. In practice, it froze Egypt under one ruler for nearly a century, preventing renewal of leadership and allowing provincial power to grow unchecked. The king who had been enthroned as a child presided over a system that aged, strained, and eventually cracked beneath his watch. The king lists speak of decades of rule, and his pyramid still rises at Saqqara. Yet the archaeological record whispers of famine, weakened control, and decline. How could a king's reign be celebrated in official texts while his country frayed beneath him? The answer lies not only in Pepi himself, but in the figures around him, his officials, his family, and his court. The court lists a long reign, but harvest records suggest decline. Why the mismatch? Pepi II's reign cannot be understood through his figure alone. Ancient Egypt was never ruled in isolation. Behind every pharaoh stood a network of royal family members, officials, priests, and governors whose roles shaped how authority functioned, or fractured. To uncover why Egypt's Old Kingdom unraveled, we must examine these figures, the motives that drove them, and the evidence that still survives on stone and papyrus. Pepi II Neferkare ascended the throne at approximately 6 years old. The throne name, Neferkare, beautiful is the Ka of Ra, linked him to divine solar power. But at such a young age, the boy king required regents. Sources suggest his mother, Enkisempepi II, and possibly an uncle or senior official, acted as guardians until he came of age. The role of Enkisempepi II, preserved through inscriptions and statues, is unusually prominent. One depiction shows her holding the child pharaoh on her lap, a striking image of maternal regency. Her influence in those early years underscores the extraordinary place of royal women in Egypt's political life. Unlike later eras where queens were often ceremonial, Old Kingdom consorts and mothers sometimes steered affairs directly, especially when kings were too young to rule unaided. It is possible that these early regencies set a precedent. By elevating a queen mother to the center of power, Pepi's court created rival power bases that later destabilized governance. Pepi's lineage belonged to the 6th dynasty, one of Egypt's most long-lasting ruling families. His father, Pepi I, and brother, Merenra I, had maintained strong central authority. But Pepi II's exceptional longevity outlived many heirs, producing succession struggles late in his reign. Egyptian reference multiple queens named Enkisenpepi, I and II, both of whom wielded influence. Royal marriages also reinforced alliances with powerful provincial families, integrating Egypt's distant regions into the royal house. These bonds, while stabilizing at first, later allowed provincial elites to leverage royal kinship into greater independence. Motivation here was pragmatic, linking the center with the provinces through marriage. Yet it had unintended results. The diffusion of royal blood into regional lines undermined the exclusivity of divine kingship. Few figures illuminate Pepi II's reign as clearly as Wayne, an official whose autobiography is carved into his tomb at Abydos. Wayne had already served Pepi's predecessors, but his career peaked under Pepi II. His inscriptions describe military campaigns into Nubia and Canaan, where he commanded troops, organized supply lines, and oversaw quarrying expeditions. Wayne recalls leading tens of thousands of soldiers and auxiliary troops, evidence of a large-scale mobilization. His loyalty to Pepi II seems unwavering, a testament to the allure of royal patronage. Yet his tomb also emphasizes his personal virtues, suggesting that officials valued self-promotion as much as service. Wayne's motives were clear: expand his prestige, secure immortality through inscriptions, and ensure his descendants inherited his elevated status. His career exemplifies how ambitious administrators tied their fate to the pharaoh, but also how they depended on a functioning central system. Without royal resources, their legacy building collapsed. As Pepi II's reign stretched on, one group gained extraordinary prominence: the provincial governors, known as nomarchs. Their tombs, scattered along the Nile Valley, reveal growing wealth and autonomy. The governor Jao of Abydos, a relative of Pepi's queens, left inscriptions describing his role in major state ceremonies. Elsewhere, in Upper Egypt, governors began constructing elaborate rock-cut tombs rivaling royal monuments in grandeur. The rise of these regional elites reflects a critical shift. Authority was no longer concentrated exclusively in Memphis, the royal capital. Their motives were dual. On one hand, they sought prestige through local building projects, inscriptions, and alliances with temples. On the other, they increasingly sought independence from the court, using economic power derived from local agriculture and trade. This decentralization sowed the seeds of collapse. When famine struck or Nile floods failed, the provinces often looked to their own governors for relief, bypassing the pharaoh. The result, a gradual erosion of the king's legitimacy. Egyptian kingship was inseparable from religion. Pepi II was presented as Horus incarnate and the son of Ra. But beneath this divine framework, priests controlled vast temple estates. These institutions accumulated wealth and manpower, becoming semi-autonomous economic engines. By Pepi II's reign, the cult of Osiris at Abydos and local temple networks had expanded dramatically. Priests' motivations included securing offerings, preserving rituals, and maintaining their own authority through hereditary priesthoods. This competing power structure diverted loyalty away from the crown. Some historians argue that Pepi's exceptionally long reign allowed temple power to grow unchecked. Had his reign ended earlier, a successor might have rebalanced royal and priestly authority. Instead, Pepi's extreme longevity created space for entrenched priestly dominance. Royal women of the 6th dynasty appear repeatedly in inscriptions, especially queens named Enkisenpepi. Their marriages and regencies reflect political maneuvering. Some were sisters of powerful officials, reinforcing provincial alliances. A statue base from Hierakonpolis names Enkisenpepi II as both mother of the king and king's wife, emphasizing her dual roles. Such evidence suggests she functioned as a stabilizing figure early on, yet her long prominence may also have encouraged rivalries between branches of the royal family. Motivation here is complex. Queens and mothers sought to preserve dynastic continuity but may also have maneuvered for their own son's succession. Late in Pepi's reign, when heirs died prematurely, these contests grew sharper. Succession disputes strained the legitimacy of the crown, contributing to instability. Other officials left inscriptions attesting to their roles in Pepi II's Egypt. Harkhuf, a governor of Elephantine, recorded his expeditions into Nubia, bringing back exotic goods and even a dancing pygmy for the young king. His motives, like Wayne's, combined loyalty with self-promotion. This anecdote, the pygmy gifted for royal amusement, offers a humanizing yet revealing glimpse. It shows the court's appetite for spectacle, but also how governors used rare tributes to secure favor. Such gestures tied provincial elites to the pharaoh, yet they also highlight a growing dependence. The court relied on governors to supply novelty and wealth, underscoring the shifting balance of power. These inscriptions are not abstract. They are the words of men who lived, carved in stone to outlast the ages. Reading them today, we glimpse the motivations that held Egypt together: ambition, loyalty, prestige, and the fissures that pulled it apart. If these ancient careers shock you, hit like, subscribe and share. Tale of History brings primary evidence to light. The most telling evidence of all lies not in words but in structure. Over Pepi II's reign, administrative offices once centered in Memphis began appearing in the provinces. Seal impressions and papyri suggest taxes and resources were increasingly managed locally rather than at the royal capital. This quiet shift reveals a fundamental motivation: provincial elites sought control over their own wealth. For the pharaoh, this meant dwindling authority. For Egypt, it marked the beginning of fragmentation. And it sets the stage for the next question: what happened when resources, once harnessed to build pyramids and sustain centralized rule, were redirected into provincial hands? That is where we turn next. The greatness of the Old Kingdom rested not only on kings and generals, but on the intricate machinery of agriculture, taxation, and labor. When that machinery faltered, even a divine pharaoh could not hold the state together. To understand Pepi II's reign, we must look at the systems that fed, employed, and taxed the Egyptian people, and how those systems gradually broke down. The Nile's annual flood was the heartbeat of Egypt. Its inundation deposited fertile silt that allowed predictable harvests of wheat and barley. When the flood came at the right level, farmers produced surpluses that sustained temples, officials, and building projects. Records from earlier dynasties show stable yields that supported pyramid construction. But climate data from soil cores and paleobotanical studies reveal that during the late Old Kingdom, Nile floods became erratic. Some years brought insufficient water, others destructive overflows. This instability strained the agrarian base. Without reliable harvests, the tax grain that flowed to Memphis dwindled. When taxes declined, the crown could no longer maintain labor forces or reward loyal officials. Egypt's economy was based on redistribution. Farmers paid taxes in kind, grain, livestock, or labor days, which the state then allocated to officials, priests, and workers on royal projects. Seal impressions from Pepi II's time show the bureaucracy at work: scribes recording quotas, warehouses tracking deliveries. Yet archaeological surveys suggest that tax collection increasingly shifted to local control. Storage facilities appear in provincial centers rather than exclusively at Memphis. This change hints at decentralization, governors holding more of the surplus themselves, and the royal court losing leverage. The motive was clear. Local elites wanted to guarantee their own food security before sending produce north. For the pharaoh, this meant diminishing authority. For ordinary farmers, it could mean heavier local demands as governors tightened their grip. Labor was Egypt's greatest resource. The pyramid complexes of Pepi II's predecessors had consumed tens of thousands of workdays. These projects were organized through a corvée system, compelling peasants to work seasonally on state construction. By Pepi II's long reign, the monumental tradition waned. His pyramid at Saqqara is smaller than those of his ancestors, a physical sign of reduced resources. Instead of vast pyramids, evidence shows smaller-scale building programs and more localized projects sponsored by governors. As central projects declined, provincial elites redirected labor toward local tombs, irrigation works, and temples. This gave them prestige but further weakened the symbolic unity of the kingdom. Egypt's prosperity also depended on trade. Expeditions to Nubia and the Levant brought exotic goods, incense, ivory, copper, and timber. Inscriptions from officials like Harkhuf describe these journeys. But in Pepi II's later years, evidence for such expeditions becomes scarce. Quarry inscriptions and desert route markers declined sharply. Archaeologists note reduced foreign materials and Egyptian burials from this period. Whether due to weakened central organization or hostile neighbors, the effect was the same: diminished access to prestige goods. For elites, this meant fewer avenues to display wealth and status. For the crown, it meant reduced ability to secure loyalty through distribution of exotic items. The human cost of economic stress shows up in bones. Bioarchaeological studies of cemeteries dated to the late Old Kingdom reveal declining average stature and signs of nutritional stress. Children's skeletons show enamel defects linked to famine episodes. Burial patterns shift from elaborate mastabas near Memphis to simpler graves scattered in provincial sites. These details matter because they show a society under strain not only at the elite level but across the population. Malnutrition and reduced life expectancy suggest that the once reliable food system had collapsed. The Old Kingdom's promise of stability gave way to widespread insecurity. Fragments of papyri from this period add another layer. The so-called Neferkare correspondence, though fragmentary, includes instructions from Pepi II to officials in distant Nubia. Such documents show that central authority still tried to reach the provinces. Yet scholars note that these letters decrease in frequency and length over time. By the close of Pepi II's reign, records of routine administration fall silent. The absence of papyri is itself a signal: either archives were not kept, or the bureaucracy no longer functioned at the same scale. All of this evidence points to one story: a kingdom whose economic engine was seizing up. Farmers harvested less, governors kept more, trade brought in fewer luxuries, and the people. If uncovering the hidden systems of ancient power grips you, support Tale of History with a like, subscribe and share. Every detail here comes straight from the evidence. What happens when central finance weakens? Officials seek autonomy. Priests secure temple estates. Governors build personal tombs rivaling royal monuments. Farmers lose faith that Memphis can protect them. Each layer of society, driven by self-preservation, pulled away from the central order. Instead of unity, Egypt became a patchwork of semi-independent regions. This was not immediate collapse, but a slow grinding erosion of authority. Pepi II's extreme longevity magnified the effect. A single ruler reigning for more than 90 years allowed governors and priestly estates to entrench themselves beyond royal correction. By the end of Pepi II's reign, inscriptions that once praised pharaonic largesse grow rare. Administrative letters cease. Papyrus archives thin out. It is as though the scribes who had chronicled Egypt's order laid down their pens. This silence is more chilling than any vivid tale. A kingdom that once recorded every delivery of grain, every consignment of stone, every royal decree, fell mute. And that silence leads directly into the next stage: crisis. What events finally tipped Egypt from strain into open collapse? The Nile had always been Egypt's lifeline. Yet paleoclimate research suggests that a broader aridification event swept across North Africa and the Near East around 2200 BCE. This 4.2 kilo-year event reduced rainfall and disrupted Nile floods. Archaeological evidence from settlement layers indicates episodes of abandonment and food shortages. Burial remains show signs of malnutrition: children with stunted growth, adults with skeletal lesions linked to dietary stress. Inscriptions from later First Intermediate period rulers recall a time of hardship, with phrases like, "The whole land was in great hunger." While those inscriptions were composed after Pepi's death, they likely echo memories of famine that began in his reign. At the same time, provincial governors grew more independent. Rock-cut tombs from sites like Assiut, Edfu, and Elephantine display inscriptions boasting of local achievements, irrigation projects, grain distribution, and even military actions. These governors presented themselves not as servants of the king, but as protectors of their own regions. One inscription from the governor Antifi, slightly later in the First Intermediate Period, declares, "I gave bread to the hungry, and clothes to the naked, when Upper Egypt was dying of hunger." Although Antifi lived after Pepi II, his words illustrate the context. Local leaders stepped in where the crown had failed. Motives were practical: ensure survival of their own districts, maintain prestige, and secure loyalty from local populations. Yet each act of local independence further eroded the pharaoh's central authority. Egypt's weakening control created openings for external threats. Evidence from Nubia suggests Egyptian authority receded during Pepi II's reign. Trade and military expeditions recorded under officials like Harkuf declined sharply in later years. Rock graffiti marking desert caravan routes also decreases, pointing to reduced activity. At the northern frontier, interactions with Levantine city-states faltered. Egyptian objects become rarer in Levantine contexts, suggesting that networks once maintained by Old Kingdom kings were breaking down. Without secure trade and border defense, Egypt lost both wealth and influence. Temples and priesthoods became increasingly independent economic forces. Estates tied to major cults accumulated land and labor. Priests recorded their authority in inscriptions that emphasized temple wealth and ritual importance rather than loyalty to Memphis. The central mystery is whether Pepi II lost control of religious legitimacy altogether. The weakening of royal power may have emboldened priests to reinterpret divine will, preparing the ground for alternative centers of spiritual authority. As Egypt staggered under famine, fragmentation, and foreign pressure, later stories speak of horrors within the palace itself. Among them, lurid tales of Pepi II presiding over institutionalized cruelty, including the so-called honey torture, and the large-scale use of insects as instruments of suffering. The watershed moment in Pepi II's reign is not a single battle or rebellion, but the gradual collapse of administration itself. For centuries, Egypt's strength rested on meticulous record-keeping. Officials tracked grain flows, labor assignments, and royal decrees on papyri sealed with clay impressions. Yet by the late 6th dynasty, those records fall abruptly silent. Archaeologists working at provincial sites have noted a striking absence of central directives after Pepi II's later years. Where once ceilings bore the names of royal officials in Memphis, they now carry the titles of local governors. This is the clearest sign that the bureaucracy, once directed from the capital, fractured into provincial hands. Evidence from governors' tombs in Upper Egypt reinforces this picture. At Assiut and Edfu, inscriptions describe leaders distributing food during famine and organizing local militias. Their texts boast of independence, not as loyal servants of the pharaoh, but as saviors of their districts. The shift was not symbolic, it marked a new political reality. Governors controlled taxation, commanded labor, and even engaged in diplomacy with neighbors. The crown became a distant, ceremonial presence. The central treasury may have emptied by this stage, forcing officials to act without waiting for royal command. Several Old Kingdom settlements were abandoned rapidly around this period. At Elephantine, evidence suggests interruptions in long-standing administrative routines. In some cemeteries, burials display hasty construction and poorer grave goods, perhaps reflecting crisis conditions. There are also indications of violence. At sites in Middle Egypt, skeletal remains show trauma consistent with conflict. While not conclusive, these finds suggest that as provinces asserted independence, clashes over land and resources followed. Outside Egypt, contemporaneous Mesopotamian and Levantine records hint at Egypt's withdrawal from international affairs. Inscriptions from Ebla and Byblos, which earlier listed Egyptian trade contacts, fall silent during the late Old Kingdom. Nubian sites show reduced Egyptian presence, the grand trading missions described by Harkuf are not repeated. For foreign observers, Egypt, once the great power of the Nile, had vanished from the international stage. Its borders were porous, its trade routes neglected, its prestige gone. Historians debate whether these changes stem primarily from climate-driven famine, from Pepi II's unprecedented longevity, or from systemic weaknesses in Egypt's centralized model. Likely it was all three. The Nile's instability strained resources, the pharaoh's long reign allowed local powers to entrench, and once provincial autonomy hardened, the center could not recover. Manetho's king list, remember Pepi's dynasty as the last of the Old Kingdom, with chaos following. Legends of cruelty, including the sensational, honey torture, may reflect attempts by later Egyptians to explain why the gods permitted such collapse. A recent discovery highlights how little we still know. In 2017, archaeologists excavating near Abydos uncovered fragments of papyri dated tentatively to the end of the Old Kingdom. The texts include incomplete accounts of grain deliveries, possibly showing attempts to maintain order longer than previously assumed. This find challenges the standard view that bureaucracy ceased entirely during Pepi II's lifetime. Instead, it suggests pockets of administration may have persisted even as the wider system collapsed. The Old Kingdom, once the most centralized and stable state on earth, broke apart under Pepi II. Provinces ruled themselves, famine struck, violence flared, and foreign states looked elsewhere. But one question remains. Was Egypt's collapse merely the product of environmental and political pressures, or did Pepi himself, through personal failures, neglect, or excess, hasten the end? The death of Pepi II did not bring renewal. Instead, his passing marked the beginning of a fragmented age known today as the First Intermediate Period. The immediate consequences were stark, weakened kingship, provincial independence, and widespread hardship. The longer-term effects reshaped Egypt and the wider Near East for generations. The short-term political consequence was the disintegration of centralized authority. The successors who claimed Pepi II's throne were short-lived and weak. King lists suggest a rapid turnover of rulers, some lasting only a few years. None commanded the unified bureaucracy or national projects of earlier kings. In the provinces, governors acted as de facto rulers. Evidence from tomb inscriptions shows them commanding militias, distributing food, and negotiating their own alliances. Egypt was no longer a single state but a patchwork of regional powers. Monumental architecture, once the hallmark of the Old Kingdom, dwindled. Pepi II's pyramid complex at Saqqara, though completed, was modest compared to earlier dynasties. After him, large-scale pyramid projects ceased for more than a century. Archaeologists studying later cemeteries note a shift from massive stone mastabas to smaller, local burials. This decline reflects both economic strain and the loss of centralized labor mobilization. Without a strong crown, resources were directed to local projects rather than grand monuments visible across the Nile Valley. Another immediate consequence was population movement. Settlement surveys show that some areas in Upper Egypt were abandoned, while others saw sudden increases in occupation, suggesting internal migration. Climatic stress likely drove families to leave failing farmlands in search of better conditions. The collapse of Egypt's Old Kingdom also altered the balance of power in the region. With Egypt no longer sending trading expeditions or projecting military influence, neighbors filled the vacuum. In Nubia, independent polities consolidated their control. Archaeological evidence points to renewed fortifications and cultural development in the Kerma region. In the Levant, city-states that once looked to Egypt for trade or protection developed more autonomy. Mesopotamian records from this era note Egyptian absence, describing instead their own rising networks. Egypt's decline thus had ripple effects across the Near East, encouraging other powers to expand and reshape the region's political map. Egyptian instability also produced a flow of skills and knowledge beyond its borders. Refugees carried agricultural techniques, craft traditions, and religious practices into neighboring lands. While difficult to quantify, scholars suggest that Egyptian expertise in irrigation, stoneworking, and administration may have spread during this period of migration. In this sense, collapse was paradoxically also a vector of cultural transmission. The very breakdown of centralized order allowed fragments of Egyptian society to diffuse across wider networks. Population studies estimate that Egypt's numbers shrank significantly during this transition. Bioarchaeological data from cemeteries suggest reduced life expectancy and higher child mortality. Combined with famine and migration, the total population may have fallen by up to 1/5. It would take centuries for Egypt to recover its old kingdom levels of prosperity. This was more than a royal failure. It was a social earthquake that transformed every layer of Egyptian life: kings, governors, priests, farmers, and children. If you want the deeper interpretation, stay. Tale of History will tie evidence to meaning in the next section. And so we reach the enduring question. Was Egypt's collapse the product of extraordinary circumstances, climate change, famine, overlong reigns, or was it inherent in the system itself, a centralized model too rigid to survive crisis? That puzzle, still debated by historians today, is where we turn next. The story of Pepi II's reign and the fall of the Old Kingdom is more than a chronicle of ancient dates. It is a study in how power endures, how institutions weaken, and how societies remember collapse. The Old Kingdom thrived on centralization. The pharaoh controlled the floodplain through taxation, labor, and divine authority. That model worked in times of abundance. But when the Nile faltered and Pepi II's reign stretched across generations, the system revealed its fragility. The bureaucracy depended too heavily on a single source of legitimacy. Once the crown could no longer compel surplus from provinces, the structure disintegrated. Officials turned local, and loyalty fragmented. The lesson is clear: even the most sophisticated institutions can crumble if they lack mechanisms for renewal and adaptation. Egypt's glory was not enough to guarantee survival. Religious ideology once bound Egypt together. The pharaoh was the living god, guarantor of order against chaos. But when famine persisted and provincial governors began to present themselves as protectors, faith in Memphis weakened. Later dynasties preserved the idea of divine kingship, but they also modified it. The Middle Kingdom rulers promoted new religious texts, such as the coffin texts, emphasizing personal salvation rather than absolute reliance on the king. These innovations may reflect lessons drawn from Pepi's failure, an attempt to rebuild legitimacy in ways more resilient than the Old Kingdom's model. The consequences of failing to manage resources under environmental stress. Bioarchaeological evidence of malnutrition, combined with paleoclimate data on Nile instability, shows how fragile Egypt's prosperity was. Instead of investing in resilience, resources were often redirected toward elite tombs or temple estates. Governors built monuments for themselves while ordinary people suffered hunger. This imbalance eroded social trust. The collapse thus illustrates how unequal distribution during crisis deepens instability. What is striking is how little later Egyptian tradition says about Pepi II. Unlike Khufu or Ramses II, he is largely absent from monumental commemoration. Manetho, writing in the Ptolemaic era, notes his extraordinarily long reign but emphasizes the weakness of the dynasty. This silence may be deliberate. Dynasties that rebuilt Egypt's power had no interest in preserving the memory of a ruler associated with collapse. Forgetting was a strategy of survival, erased the failures to restore faith in kingship. Modern archaeology, however, restores what official memory suppressed. Inscriptions from provincial tombs, fragments of papyri, and skeletal evidence tell the story that later rulers tried to obscure. By reading these scattered traces, we reconstruct the lived experience of famine, migration, and fragmentation. It is a reminder that history is never only what rulers choose to record. Sometimes it survives in the silences, in missing papyri, in abandoned settlements, in the bones of the malnourished. So what should we learn from Pepi II's world? That no ruler, however divine, can resist the pressure of failing resources and overstretched power. That legitimacy built on ritual alone cannot feed the hungry. Was Egypt's collapse inevitable, or could a shorter reign, a more flexible system, have saved the Old Kingdom? If this story challenged what you thought you knew of ancient Egypt, Subscribe to Tale of History and comment below with what surprised you most. The boy who reigned for a lifetime left a kingdom in ruins, and a warning written not in stone, but in silence.